Welcome back to Chill Sports History, where we slow down and look back at the stories, teams, players, and moments that shaped the games we love. In this episode, we're going back to the early 2000s, to a time when the NBA was already growing around the world, but still had moments where the league could suddenly feel much bigger than it had before. This is not a story about a championship team, or a last-second shot, or a dynasty being built. It is the story of a player whose career was shorter than it should have been, but whose impact reached far beyond the number of games he played. It is the story of Yao Ming, the 7'6" center from Shanghai who came to the Houston Rockets, became one of the most recognizable athletes in the world, and helped connect two basketball worlds that were already reaching toward each other. In the summer of 2002, the Houston Rockets were preparing to make one of the most unusual draft picks in NBA history. They held the first overall pick, and with it, the chance to choose the player who would become the face of their franchise. In most years, that meant picking a college star, or maybe a teenager from an American high school, someone who had already been watched, scouted, debated, and pulled apart by basketball people in the United States for years. But this time the player at the center of everything was different. He was 7 feet 6 inches tall. He was from Shanghai. He had never played college basketball in America. And when most NBA fans first heard his name, they were not quite sure what to expect. His name was Yao Ming, and the question around him was not simply whether he could play. The question was whether one player could carry the hopes of a franchise, the attention of a league, and the expectations of a country, all at the same time. Yao Ming's story is not a championship story in the usual sense. He never won an NBA title. He never got the long playoff run that seemed possible when he was at his best. His career was shorter than it should have been, and by the time he retired, there was still a feeling that basketball had only seen part of what he might have become. But not every important sports story ends with a trophy. Sometimes a player changes the shape of the game in a different way. Sometimes the legacy is not just about banners, rings, or records. Sometimes it is about making the game feel bigger than it felt before. And in Yao's case, that is exactly what happened. Before Yao Ming arrived, basketball was already popular in China. That part of the story is important because it keeps the whole thing honest. Yao did not bring basketball to a place where it had never existed. The game had been played and loved there for generations. And the NBA had already become a global league in many ways. Michael Jordan had fans everywhere. The Dream Team had changed what international basketball could look like. Players from Europe, Africa, South America, and Asia had already begun to alter the NBA's sense of itself. But Yao was still something different. He was not just an international player coming to America to test himself against the best players in the world. He was a Chinese superstar entering the NBA at the exact moment when the league wanted to become more global, and when millions of fans in China were ready to follow one of their own on that stage. Yao's basketball life began in Shanghai, in a world that was already built around his height, his talent, and the sense that he might become something rare. His parents had both played basketball, and by the time he was young, it was obvious that he had a body that would make people look twice. But height alone does not make a basketball player. That was one of the things that would follow Yao for years. People could see the size immediately, but the size almost became a distraction from the skill. Yao was not just tall. He had soft hands. He had touch around the rim. He could shoot free throws better than most centers. He had footwork, patience, and a feel for the game that made him more than a novelty. Long before NBA fans knew him well, Chinese basketball fans had already seen that he was not just an unusually tall young man. He was a real player. With the Shanghai Sharks, Yao grew into the kind of prospect who could no longer be treated as a local story. He was becoming a national figure before he ever stepped onto an NBA court. In the Chinese Basketball Association, he developed into a dominant center, and by 2002, he had helped lead Shanghai to a league championship. He was not leaving China as an unfinished curiosity. He was leaving after reaching the top of the basketball world he had grown up in. The next question was whether he could survive in the basketball world that everyone else considered the highest level. The NBA in 2002 was still a league of powerful big men, Shaquille O'Neal was one of the most dominant forces the sport had ever seen. Tim Duncan was already a champion. Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki, Chris Webber, and other frontcourt stars gave the league a level of size and skill that made the paint feel crowded with giants. For Yao, this meant that he was not arriving in a soft era for big men. He was not going to be protected from physical play. He was not going to be allowed to learn quietly. Every game would be a test. Every matchup would be treated as evidence. If he struggled, people would say the NBA was too fast, too strong, and too rough for him. If he succeeded, the meaning of that success would stretch far beyond Houston. When the Rockets took him first overall, the pick carried an unusual mix of excitement and uncertainty. There was the basketball question, which was simple enough. Could Yao be a franchise center? But there were other questions too. How would he adjust to life in the United States? How would he handle American media? How would he deal with the language barrier? How would he balance his NBA career with his responsibilities to Chinese basketball? How would Houston build around him? And how would he handle being seen not just as a rookie, but as a symbol? Most first overall picks face pressure. Yao faced pressure from multiple directions at once. His early days in the NBA were not instantly smooth. That is part of what makes the story better. If Yao had arrived and dominated from the first night, the episode would be simpler, but maybe less human. Instead, there was adjustment. He had to learn the pace of the league. He had to learn how quickly defenses collapsed, how strong NBA centers were, how little time he had to make decisions. He had to learn a new country while also learning a new league. And as he did, people were watching from everywhere. In Houston, fans wanted to know if they had found their next great big man. Around the NBA, skeptics wanted to know if the hype was real. In China, millions of people wanted to see one of their own prove that he belonged. At first, some of the attention around Yao was not especially fair. There was curiosity, but there was also doubt. There were jokes about his height, questions about his strength, and assumptions that treated him more like an experiment than a player. The NBA had seen international stars before, but Yao's arrival created a different kind of spotlight. He was not just representing himself. Whether he wanted to or not, he was representing Chinese basketball, Asian athletes, and the NBA's global ambitions all at the same time. That was too much to put on one person. But somehow, Yao carried it with a calmness that became part of his identity. What helped most was that, little by little, Yao began to make the basketball argument for himself. He did not need to be loud. He did not need to sell himself as a showman. His game did that for him. When he caught the ball deep, he could finish softly. When defenders fouled him, he could step to the free throw line and punish them. When teams treated him like a slow-footed giant, he showed that he had better coordination than they expected. He was never the most explosive player on the floor, and he was never built like the more violent interior forces of the era. But he had a smoothness that made him unusual. He could be both massive and graceful, both powerful and careful. That rookie season became the first proof that Yao was not just a marketing idea. He averaged double figures, became an all-star starter, and gave Houston a new identity almost immediately. The all-star selection itself caused debate because Yao's popularity was already enormous, and fan voting reflected that. But the debate sometimes missed the larger point. The attention may have helped put him in the spotlight, but it did not make him an NBA player. He had to do that part himself. And by the end of his first season, it was clear that the league was not watching a gimmick. It was watching a young center with the tools to become one of the best big men in basketball. The Rockets had a proud history with centers. Hakeem Olajuwon had given the franchise its greatest years, and one of the most beautiful big man games basketball had ever seen. That history made Yao's arrival feel even more significant. Houston knew what it looked like when a great center became the center of everything. No one was asking Yao to be Hakeem. That would have been unfair. But in a city that understood the value of a franchise big man, Yao gave the Rockets a new version of an old dream. The idea was simple and powerful. Build around the giant in the middle Give him the right pieces and see how far he could take you. In the early years, Yao played with Steve Francis and Coutinho Mobley, a pair of guards who had already given Houston energy and personality. The team was not perfect, but it was interesting. There was a sense that something was beginning. The Rockets were not yet a contender, but they had direction. Yao was learning, the city was embracing him, and the NBA was discovering that the story had layers beyond the box score. Houston was not only building a team for local fans, it was becoming a team followed across the world. For a franchise, that was a strange and powerful thing. The Rockets were still based in Texas, but because of Yao, they belonged to a much larger audience. That is one of the reasons the Yao story works so well. It is not just about basketball globalization in the abstract. It is about a very specific connection between one player, one city, and one country. Houston became meaningful to fans who might never visit Texas. Rockets games became appointment viewing for people on the other side of the world. A regular season matchup in the United States could feel personal in China because Yao was there. Sports can do that. They can make distant places feel familiar. They can make a team from a city you have never seen feel like part of your life. Yao did that for the Rockets. But the basketball still had to matter, and for a while, it really seemed like Houston might be building towards something serious. The next major turn came when the Rockets paired Yao with Tracy McGrady. McGrady was one of the most gifted scorers in the NBA, a smooth, explosive wing who could create his own shot from almost anywhere. On paper, it made sense. Yao could anchor the middle, McGrady could control the perimeter, and Houston could have the kind of inside-outside star pairing that had defined plenty of great teams. It was not hard to imagine a version of the future where Yao and McGrady became one of the defining duos of the 2000s. For a while, the promise was real. When Yao and McGrady were healthy, the Rockets could look dangerous. They had size, skill, shot-making, and two stars who could hurt opponents in completely different ways. Yao demanded attention in the post. McGrady demanded attention everywhere. The Rockets were not always deep enough, and the Western Conference was not forgiving, but they were good enough to make people believe. That belief is a big part of the story too, because Yao's NBA career is filled with moments where the door seems to open, only for something to get in the way. The playoffs became a place of frustration. In 2005, the Rockets faced the Dallas Mavericks and started the series by winning the first two games on the road. That should have been the beginning of a breakthrough. Instead, Dallas came back, and Houston lost the series in 7 games. For a team trying to prove it belonged among the real contenders, it was painful. For Yao, it was another reminder that progress in the NBA is rarely simple. A great player can arrive, a great teammate can join him, a team can look dangerous, and still, the climb can be brutally difficult. Over the next few years, injuries became the shadow over everything. It is impossible to tell Yao's story without them, but it is also important not to let them erase what he was when healthy. At his best, Yao was one of the most efficient and skilled centers in the league. He could average close to 20 points and 10 rebounds, protect the rim, draw double teams, and steady Houston's offense. He was not just famous, he was excellent. The sadness is that his body was being asked to survive a workload that was almost impossible. He played NBA seasons. He carried international responsibilities. He had the physical stress that comes with being 7 feet 6 inches tall and playing in a league built on speed, collisions, and constant movement. Eventually, the pressure showed. In 2006 and 2007, Yao was playing some of the best basketball of his career, but the interruptions kept coming. Foot and leg injuries cost him time, and each absence changed the rhythm of the Rockets. Then McGrady's own health problems complicated the picture even more. The dream of Yao and McGrady was always just close enough to believe in, and never stable enough to fully arrive. That is one of the quiet heartbreaks of this era of the Rockets. The idea was not foolish. It was not a failed plan from the start. It was a plan that made sense, but needed health, timing, and luck. Houston never got enough of any of them. Then came 2008, and Yao's story expanded again. The Beijing Olympics were not just another international tournament. They were a massive national moment for China, and Yao was one of the faces of it. He had already become a symbol through the NBA, but the Olympics made that symbolism even stronger. He was not simply a basketball player returning home. He was one of the most recognizable Chinese athletes in the world, carrying expectations that were emotional, athletic, and national all at once. For many athletes, playing in a home Olympics would be the greatest thrill of a career. For Yao, it was also another layer of pressure on a body that had already endured so much. The image of Yao at the Beijing Olympics is one of the clearest images of his larger legacy. He was enormous, not just in height, but in meaning. He represented China to the world, and he represented the NBA to China. He was a Houston Rocket, but also something much broader. Yao connected two basketball worlds because he belonged deeply to both. He was not a visitor in the NBA, and he was not just an ambassador from afar. He was inside the league, competing against its best players, while also carrying the hopes of fans who saw his success as something shared. After the Olympics, there was still one more strong basketball chapter left. The 2008 to 2009 Rockets were not the perfect version of the Yao era, but they had toughness, balance, and a chance to do something meaningful. In the first round of the playoffs, Houston beat the Portland Trail Blazers, giving the Rockets their first playoff series win in years. For Yao, it was a long-awaited step. After years of questions, injuries, and close calls, he had finally helped push Houston into the second round. It was not a championship, but it mattered. For a career that had been judged so often by what had not happened in the playoffs, it was a real moment of relief. Then came the Los Angeles Lakers. In Game 1 of the second round, Yao had one of those moments that stays in memory because it seemed to contain the whole story at once. He was hurt during the game, went back toward the locker room, and then returned. He kept playing. Houston won. It felt like the kind of playoff moment that can redefine a player's career, the kind of moment that gives a team belief and gives a fan base something to hold on to. But just a few games later, Yao's foot injury ended his playoffs. Without him, and without a healthy McGrady, the Rockets still fought the Lakers all the way to 7 games. That made the whole thing even more bittersweet. Houston was tough enough to scare the eventual champions, but not healthy enough to finish the job. That series is probably the closest the Yao era came to its full emotional payoff. It showed the strength of the team, the respect Yao had earned, and the cruelty of the timing. The Rockets had a real chance to make a deeper run, but the body of their franchise center could not hold up. After that, Yao was never really the same NBA player again. He missed the entire next season, tried to return, and played only a handful of games before the injuries finally made the decision for him. In 2011, he retired from the NBA at just 30 years old. A career ending that early usually creates a certain kind of debate. People ask what might have been. They ask how much more a player could have done with better health. They ask whether the career was great enough, long enough, complete enough. With Yao, those questions exist, but they do not fully capture him. Of course, there is a basketball what if. A healthy Yao through his early 30s would have changed the Rockets. It might have changed playoff races in the West. It might have given Houston a real chance to build the contender it had been chasing for years. But Yao's importance does not depend only on the version of his career that never happened. The career he actually had was already enough to change things. He was an 8-time All-Star. He made all NBA teams. He averaged 19 points and 9 rebounds for his career. He gave the Rockets a franchise center in an era when great centers still shaped the league. He stood up to Shaquille O'Neal, Duncan, Garnett, and the other giants of his time. He was not always the best big man in the NBA, but he was absolutely part of the conversation. And for a player carrying as much off-court weight as Yao carried, that matters. The global meaning of his career only works because the basketball was real. That is the key to understanding Yao Ming. He was a bridge, but he was not only a bridge. He was an ambassador, but he was not only an ambassador. He was marketable, but he was not only a marketing story. If he had not been able to play, the rest would have faded quickly. Fans might have tuned in at first out of curiosity or pride, but they would not have stayed in the same way. Yao made people stay because he was good, because he improved, because he competed, because he looked at home in a league where many people had expected him to look out of place. And in doing that, he changed the way the NBA imagined its own reach. The league had already been international before Yao, but his presence made the connection with China feel personal and immediate. He gave Chinese fans a direct emotional stake in an NBA team. He gave American fans a chance to see a Chinese player not as a distant prospect, but as a nightly opponent, teammate, all-star, and franchise player. He made the idea of a global NBA feel less like a business plan and more like a lived reality. There is something quietly powerful about the way Yao handled all of it. He could have been overwhelmed by the attention. He could have tried to become larger than the game around him. But he often seemed grounded, thoughtful, and aware of the strange position he occupied. He knew he represented more than himself, but he also knew that the only way to make that representation meaningful was to do the work. Practice, play, recover, adjust, compete, then do it again. In a career filled with massive symbolism, the most important thing was still the simple basketball job in front of him. By the time Yao entered the Hall of Fame, his legacy had settled into something bigger than a traditional stat sheet. The numbers were strong, but not as long as they might have been. The playoff resume was meaningful, but incomplete. The championship column was empty. And yet, there was no real question that he belonged in basketball history. He belonged because he had been one of the best centers of his era. He belonged because he had carried an impossible spotlight with grace. And he belonged because for a period of time in the 2000s, one player in Houston made basketball feel like it was happening in two places at once. That may be the best way to remember Yao Ming's career. Every time he stepped onto the floor, the game had more than one audience. There were fans in Houston watching their center. There were fans across the NBA watching a new kind of international star. There were fans in China watching someone who made the faraway world of the NBA feel close. A rebound in Texas could matter in Shanghai. A playoff game in Los Angeles could matter to people waking up across the world. A Houston Rockets jersey could become a symbol of something much larger than one franchise. Yao Ming's story is not about bringing basketball to a place that did not have it. It is about connecting places where basketball already mattered. It is about what happens when a player becomes a shared point of pride, curiosity, pressure, and admiration. It is about the way sports can shrink distance. It is about the way one athlete can make two different fan bases feel like they are watching the same dream. And that is why his story still matters. There are players with longer careers. There are players with more playoff success. There are players with bigger trophy cases, longer highlight reels, and cleaner endings. But there are not many players who changed the emotional geography of the sport the way Yao did. He made Houston matter deeply to fans who lived thousands of miles away. He made the NBA feel closer to China, and he made Chinese basketball feel closer to the NBA. He reminded people that a sports league can grow through television deals and marketing plans, but it becomes truly global through players people care about. In the end, Yao did not need a championship to change the game. His career was shorter than fans wanted, but long enough to leave a mark that has never really gone away. He helped make the Rockets a global team. He helped make the NBA feel more open to the world. He showed that a player could come from a different basketball system, carry the pressure of millions, and still earn respect in the hardest league in the sport. And for all the what-ifs, that is the part that lasts. Yao Ming connected two basketball worlds, and for a while, when he stood in the middle of the court in a Houston Rockets jersey, those two worlds felt like one. That is all for this episode of Chill Sports History. Thanks for spending this time with the story of Yao Ming, a player whose career reminds us that impact in sports is not always measured by championships alone. Sometimes it is measured by the people who start watching because of you, the places that feel connected because of you, and the doors that stay open after you are gone. Yao's time in the NBA did not last as long as it should have, but the bridge he helped build is still part of basketball's story today. Until next time, take care, and thanks for listening. We love sharing these fun stories with you every week. If you'd like to come back for another story, we'd be very happy to have you here, and we can't wait to share more with you.